Hello, welcome to the interview room here at the Voice of American Law Enforcement on LifeZet. I have a great guest with me. He brings with him a, I'm going to say, more than a disturbing message of what's happening in one of America's major cities, Indianapolis. And his message is one that all Americans should be listening to. His name is Rick Snyder. He is the Fraternal Order of Police president of the union of the Fraternal Order of Police that represents the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department and several other agencies as well. But it's that police department which we're going to be talking about today. Rick, thanks so much for joining me here on the Voice of American Law Enforcement.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Rick, there is some really disturbing stuff taking place in your city. It seems like there is a power grab that is taking place by the mayor, city council, and other politicians that are putting the lives of police officers and citizens in jeopardy. Would you talk, first of all, I want the audience to know that the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department is a major police department. If you would just give a little bit about the fact that it's a metropolitan police department, how many officers you have, how many people you serve.
Sure. The Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department was consolidated in 2007 and brought the City Police Department and the Sheriff's Department together for law enforcement for the entire county. So we're unique in where the county is the city is the county. And so with IMPD, we have 1,700 police officers, and we are responsible for patrolling about 372 square miles in central Indiana.
Now, you have a mayor and council system. You also have a police chief that instead of the sheriff being the boss, it's the chief of police. That is an appointed position, is it not?
Yeah, actually, that's appointed under the mayor's authority, and so the entire police department is under the executive branch of our local government. And so the mayor appoints the chief of police. We do have a civilian police merit board that is a check and balance on the chief's discretion related to discipline, hiring, promotions, things such as that. But ultimately, the chief has the authority over the police department. Our legislative branch, our city council is a city-county council, and with that merged government, there's actually 25 councilors that we work with in the legislative branch.
Okay, so that's a huge city council, county council. The police department was called upon during the major riots that took place recently, and there was a great deal of violence that took place, and the agency, which is supposed to keep those streets safe and work to stop the violence, you guys didn't exactly get to do what you're supposed to do, did you?
Yeah, we have not been immune to the violent rioting like most every other major city in the country. We experienced back-to-back nights of rioting during the summer, in which in downtown Indianapolis, we had over 100 businesses that were damaged or destroyed. For those folks who ever come to Indianapolis, they know our downtown is the jewel of our city, is world renowned for our hospitality, but also our convenience, cleanliness, and accessibility. But our downtown was destroyed. We're still bearing the consequences of that, with many of those businesses either out of business or trying to recover. We, like many other cities, were boarded up for many, many weeks, and we continue to suffer the loss of business. But our officers during that time frame were under constant gunfire, which isn't talked about much in these discussions publicly. Constant gunfire, as well as having bottles and rocks and everything else thrown at them. And the challenge was this: our political structure placed limitations on our officers and the leaders of the police department in terms of our ability to respond to those threats and those dangers. And as a result, the response was compromised due to politicians and their directions. and we lost our downtown. Thank God we didn't lose an officer, but we did have 4 people who were shot in 2 days, 2 of which lost their lives. And so beyond the property damage, you had loss of life, and that we can never recover.
How many officers were injured during that time period?
We actually did not sustain many injuries. We did have some, but we had multiple officers. The radio traffic is unbelievable, and that still has not been publicized yet. But people will be shocked when they actually hear the radio traffic of officers, one after the other, calling for help, being pinned down by gunfire, single units being stuck by rioters and unable to get out and having to be rescued, and all these other things. It was just absolute chaos and pandemonium. And here was the problem. We had additional resources available to us. We had a contingent from the Indiana State Police. We had a contingent from the Indiana National Guard. We had the ability for our political leaders to invoke curfews and other such restrictions, and they took advantage of none of those things. And as a result, we had a limited number of officers who couldn't even get additional help from throughout the city from our officers to help resolve those situations.
When I hear stories like this, it curdles my blood. Your guys are out on the line facing quite literally armed enemy attackers, and you're not allowed. If your department had wanted to and committed the resources, could it have stopped the violence within a short period of time?
Absolutely, and I can prove that. And I always tell the public, don't take our word for it. Here's how you can confirm it. The rioting began on a Friday night, and then Saturday night. Sunday, the decision was made to invoke a curfew, and the mayor of our city still rejected the opportunity to have the state police and the National Guard assist us. But within 10 minutes of him declining that publicly, the governor of Indiana thanked him very much and said, we will still send our folks in to protect state property in downtown Indianapolis. Making those changes completely reversed course on Sunday. So what I always tell people is don't take our word for it. Just tell me what changed from absolute pandemonium, chaos, and rioting Friday and Saturday night, and none of that on Sunday. It was that we took advantage of the resources available to us, and our officers were allowed to do their jobs and protect property and protect lives in our city.
It's funny because I mostly read about peaceful protests in your city.
Yeah, that was not the case. We did have peaceful protests. And, I want to stress this, just like you hear law enforcement all over the country do. We are sworn to uphold the Constitution. We're not sworn to uphold politicians. And when political decisions are made that results in the loss of life and property, it breaks the heart of our officers. It breaks the spirit of our law enforcement officers. Some have suggested that's the point. I like to see the better in people, but what's important to know is we did have peaceful protesters, and we took very seriously our obligation to protect them so that they could exercise their rights. That's what we're sworn to uphold, and we did that. Unfortunately, those peaceful protests were hijacked by people who were intent on committing violence and crimes, and then that was backed up and supported by politicians who didn't have the political will to allow our officers to stand the line and keep those things from happening, and people were harmed because of it.
Do you believe that there was a organized element to this?
That's one of the things we're still waiting to find out. We asked some very strong questions, and there really is one overwhelming one. When our officers were standing the lines and then pulled back from the lines, and the riots were in place and buildings were burning all over the city and rounds from high-powered rifles were being fired at officers and civilians alike, we had a very simple question for our politicians, our political leaders, which was, where were you? It's a simple question. It deserves a simple answer, and we have yet to get those answers months later.
Do you know what groups were involved in this? Was this an Antifa-led assault? Was this Black Lives Matter? What was there a particular name of any? Did any groups come out and were very visible in this?
Um, those investigations are still occurring, of course, but there were several public statements and suggestions that groups such as those and others were involved as well. And again, you know, here's the thing, and I reiterate it all the time, that what precipitated these protests, we take very seriously. There are always opportunities for us as a profession, professionals in law enforcement, to consistently improve. And we have to place a high value on the sanctity of life, not only for our officers, which is what's talked about a lot of times, but also the residents that we serve. That's primary and paramount. That can't get lost in this. But yet, what we keep seeing is that due to decisions made by those who are not in law enforcement, it impacts the safety of our community and the very people who are trying to make their voices heard. And that can't be allowed in any civilized society. That's why those rights are so precious and need to be protected.
So, coming on the heels of this debacle that was created by your political leadership, your mayor, your council members, suddenly there is a surprise that comes from them in terms of basically trying to take over the police department and reduce the power of the chief, giving it over to a group of politically appointed civilians, which include the possibility of ex-felons. How did this happen?
So we did have a proposal that was introduced by counselors that was supported by some very outspoken, agenda-driven organizations that called for the establishment of what they call a General Orders Board. The purpose of this proposal was to strip the authority of the chief of police over the policies for policing, the policies for how we do criminal investigations, policies of how we do arrests, and all other business of the police department, and put it into the hands of a board. The board would be a 7-person board, but 4 of those members would be civilians, only 3 law enforcement. Civilians would have control of the board. The problem is this: we fully support civilian input, civilian participation, and the perspective of the community that we serve. But we're not talking about oversight. We're not talking about advise and review and providing input. We're talking about actually taking and assuming responsibility for the policy making. And the crazy thing is that under this proposal, the chief of police of the police department has no authority over the policy. They're just expected to carry out whatever the board comes up with and creates for them. And then we learned that there were also no prohibitions intentionally by the ones sponsoring the proposal, no prohibitions about criminal conviction histories of the civilians involved. And it was explicitly made clear that even convicted felons could be selected to serve on this board and oversee the policy for the police department.
But if I understand the proposal properly, if you're an ex-felon, if you've been convicted of murder, rape, robbery, whatever, you can serve on the board. But if you are a retired police officer, a former police officer, the sister of a police officer, the son of a police officer, or any relation to a police officer, you're not allowed.
Yeah, that was the other thing. There was very deliberate steps taken and amendments made into the proposal to absolutely exclude any active officer, retired law enforcement officer, or family member of an officer from participating. And that's not just an officer on the IMPD, that's an officer of any department anywhere in the country. And so if you have civilians, residents living in the community, taxpayers, who happen by mere circumstance to have a relative that's in law enforcement, even in another state, they're prohibited by their own government from participating on a government board over really the number one responsibility of government, which is the safety of the public. And so it rendered public safety families, policing families, as second-class citizens in their own community, and elevated those folks who have made poor decisions in life, have suffered criminal convictions, elevated them to positions to be able to, again, oversee the policy for the police department. Many have said, including myself, it's really like being in the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, very much so. So is this, this is supported by your mayor?
The mayor has intimated to the council that if they pass this, that he would sign it. To our shock, even on the heels of his chief of police, who he appoints, publicly expressing his concerns in the fact that he did not support this proposal. The mayor, his mayor, immediately said that he would, and so it creates this division, this dissension. It breaks down the unity of command, which always affects morale within the police department. And quite frankly, the residents in our community are beside themselves. They didn't know anything about this proposal. As they learn about it, they support the chief of police. And listen, again, there is civilian oversight. You elect a mayor, you elect a city county council, they oversee the police department. We answer to the mayor through the chief of police, but there are barriers that protect policing decisions from the politics of the day, intentionally. Right. And by design. But that is being broken down and wiped out by politicians who have what appear to be other agendas at hand.
Where is this in the process now? Is this already been voted in, or is this coming up for a vote?
Yeah, it's been passed out of committee. It'll be voted upon by the full council next week. As more people learn about this, they are starting to engage and make their thoughts known. We're hopeful. I've made clear, listen, we could have a complete civilian board if it's an advisory board, and the ultimate authority remains with the chief. And it's not just the authority of the chief, it's the accountability that comes with that. If we don't have that, we blur the lines of accountability. Politicians distance themselves when things don't go like they want them to go and can point fingers at the civilian board. The civilian board points fingers at the police and the chief and the police are pointing fingers back at the politicians. And then there's no real accountability. And guess who suffers? It's the residents that we're sworn to protect. And it's often the most marginalized folks in our communities. And so we've got to stand the line. If this can happen in Indianapolis, it's coming to a city near you. And it's what many people view as an end run around the debacle of the defunding the police debate, and another way of going about that in a different direction. And again, I think the test run is here in Indianapolis, and then if they can move it to other cities.
This sounds like an end run against democracy. I mean, if this was put before the voters, do you think it would pass?
I don't, but I think that is a worthy endeavor. I think something that monumental should be placed on the ballot for the voters to provide their input. But here's the deal: the very people proposing this, they're not holding themselves to the same level of accountability. Our counselors don't have a civilian board that reviews any complaints against them. They have an ethics committee that's made up of fellow counselors who investigate and pass judgment on fellow counselors. And they don't hold themselves to these same standards. We have other boards that exist for our school system, our airport, our library system, and we get that. But they don't allow convicted felons on them, and they are also a subset and set apart from the political establishment. People want a clear line of accountability through the mayor to the chief to the department. And ultimately, those elected officials answer to the community for the decisions and the actions that are taken. But here again, we have politicians that are distancing themselves from that, and at the same time, really creating, we fear, significant problems for the community we serve.
At the end of the day, the lives that are on the line are those of the men and women who are working behind that badge, and also the people in the community. They're the ones that are going to be suffering from decisions made because of the political elite that apparently are making this power play. Well, I wish you the best of luck. We'll reconvene after this vote, and we'll talk about what it means. And I really appreciate, Rick, you taking the time to come on to the Voice of American Law Enforcement and fill us in on what's going on in Indianapolis.
Absolutely. Our pleasure. God bless.